Thank you everyone for joining us here today. We absolutely appreciate your time and we're very excited to bring you some really key insights, some very interesting visual storytelling when it comes to putting inclusion at the forefront of sport for all of your visual storytelling needs. As Sue said, my name is Jacqueline Bourke. I'm the head of creative insights at EMEA for Getty Images. What does that mean? What is the work of my team? Well, essentially, we're very much here to understand what are the types of visual languages that best connect with a particular audience in a particular moment in time. Now, we all know that sports is a very powerful and emotive ways in which sports rights organizations and brands can very deeply connect with today's audiences. So whether you're a sports fan, you're a non-fan, we do know that we are living in an increasingly visual world. And with more content being consumed every day, it's very important that you take an inclusive visual storytelling approach. Now, it's easy to say that, but what does that actually mean? What do you need to consider? And how can it have a sizable impact on creating much more visibility, for example, around women's sport? So to that end, I'm very proud to present Getty Images Visual GPS Insights platform. And this is where essentially all of the visual insights, the wonderful research, and the recommendations and points to consider we're going to discuss in the next 40 minutes is very much backed by data. So we here at Getty Images have pioneered visual research methodology. And we introduced about 2.75 years ago now, Getty Images Visual GPS. And this is essentially where it is based on the last 27 years of imagery, expertise, and data insights. So we bring together a combined approach. We look at, for instance, understanding how does the sports fan feel? How does the non-sports fan feel? What do they want to see when it comes to visualizing imagery around sport? We also want to understand, well, what is visual appetite like when it comes to media? What types of visual stories are media searching for? What are the types of visuals they're putting out to represent different kinds of sport? How has that evolved over time? And again, we're bringing all of our creative expertise here at Getty Images, whether it's very much across the insights team, our art directors, our photographers, our videographers, our curators, and so on, to really bring forward very key insights for you today. So before I start, I just want to apologize. First of all, I'm struggling a little bit with my throat today. It's that time of year where a frog has visited, but hopefully I'll get through without coughing too loudly and interrupting you. But essentially, we're going to start off today with a very broad lens. I'm going to start off by really focusing on inclusive sport. And I wanted to go back into a little bit more recent times. And while we hope we've moved very much into a post-COVID world in some sense, when we look at our unique perspective here at Getty Images, we do look at the moment when the sports industry went through huge disruption. And we really begin to see that the types of stories that we are capturing to really reflect the world as it is, there was a COVID impact on those types of sports visuals. For the first time really here at Getty Images, we were seeing stories like this being captured by our photographers around the world. It was very much focused on the disruption, for example, to athletes in their training programs, in the run-up to key events like the Olympics. And what you really begin to see enter the frame was much more empathy for female athletes. There was much more realness to the everyday situations they were really trying to get through to keep their mental health on track, to keep their physical performance on track, and to really hope and understand, for example, when the Olympics was going to be moved forward. And we also understood that when it came to female sports, already female athletes are fighting for greater visibility. Through the COVID pandemic, we really want to ensure that we are continuing to keep female athletes within the lens on the media landscape. And to do that under very difficult lockdown conditions required a lot of trust by female athletes who very graciously, generously, and kindly, invited our photographers in to capture how they were going through their training practices, the disruption to that, and how they were persevering to really move forward to keep on track for their key events. Now, it also had a sizable impact on commercial advertising and the types of visuals, for example, here at Getty Images, our corporate customers, our small to medium businesses, or advertising agencies, or even types of visuals in the media, we begin to see there was much more desire to bring realness into the storytelling, to reflect the world as it is, to show that you had much more messier homes, for example. We've traditionally seen much more polish and much more clean types of kitchens, for example, or living rooms. But also I thought what was quite interesting is that the focus was very much on fitness, it was on sport, and it was very much where people were trying to encourage people to continue to look after their physical and mental health by turning their back gardens, the small piece of grass that might be out in front of their council estate. And it was very much trying to understand whether it was through the power of technology, how they could keep connected, how they could still enter that culture of belonging that sports so often can provide. Now, we've seen that reflected in visuals. We also wanted to understand and listen very closely to how consumers felt. So looking around the world, we here at Getty Images survey a minimum of 7,000 plus people in 25 countries around the world, on average about every 4 months. And it's really to understand what are they experiencing, what are the challenges they're facing, and then ultimately, what are the visuals that best connect with them. So we found when it comes to sport, in challenging times, people told us consistently that they lean on sports to transport themselves to another world. Now, depending on the country, there are different reasons why this might drive them. For the UK, for example, UK consumers told us it's very much about nostalgia of sport and the role it played when they were younger. And often when there's uncertainty, we find that nostalgia, looking back to your childhood, those types of visual stories can connect much deeper. But ultimately, looking across those 25 countries, we found that the top priority for people to lean on sports was very much focused on mental health. So we found that 78% told us that engaging with sports is good for one's mental health. So ultimately, we found one of our key takeaways we wanted to share with you today, and it's of no surprise to anyone here on the call, that very much the role of sports in consumers all around the world is really down to holistic health benefits. And ultimately, the emotional well-being that sports offers is far more compelling than the physical benefits when it comes to driving that key participation. Now, when we look to more the elite side of sports, we have found that there's also an expectation by consumers that mental health should be acknowledged better and supported by athletes and sports leagues, and that it can be a very powerful way for an athlete to talk about their mental health that really connects with people around the world. So we found on average 68% feel that athletes and sport leagues should talk more about mental health. Now, again, when I look at a key sporting event like the Olympics, and if we think about Tokyo 2021, and we look at what were the top stories that were most downloaded here at Getty Images by our media customers, that were shared out there to huge audiences, and what was new and what was unique, these are two very key examples. So you'll all recognize Tom Daley on the left-hand side, who spoke a lot about how he took to knitting when it comes to, looking after his mental health, when it comes to, very much supporting his performance throughout the Olympics. We all know the very amazing, generous, brave story, of Simone Biles and how much she shared about her own journey throughout the Olympics and how that really transformed turning what I would call a vulnerability into a strength. When you think about some of those traditional advertising campaigns that some brand sponsors can run over the years when it comes to key sporting events, there's always the universal story that people engage with, which is, the challenges and the sacrifices that athletes have to endure, the supportive family that's there early in the morning, late in the evening, the coaches, and ultimately it's always a story of perseverance, determination, and ultimately success. And I think what Simone Biles did here very interesting was disrupt that story and bring all together a different type of storytelling that spoke about her journey through the sport. We also know that for an end consumer, again, there's a huge interest in really understanding how inclusive is a particular sport. And that can really drive participation within a sport. So we found that 65%, which is quite high, really believe that the sports industry needs to do a better job of including people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's in their ownership, their leadership, their coaching, or their employee base. And for people who have just gone through the COVID pandemic, I don't think it's surprising to see that an overwhelming majority now expect sports to be accessible to everyone. And ultimately, they are placing responsibility for this on sports organizations, with over half placing responsibility to create an atmosphere of inclusivity and a deep sense of belonging. But increasingly, they're putting even more pressure on brands. So 8 in 10 people now expect brands in all of their visual communications to be consistently committed to inclusion and diversity. Yet, they're telling us that brands are falling short. Only 14% feel that they're accurately represented in advertising imagery. So there's quite a great opportunity here to understand how can we do better? How can we bring a more inclusive lens, better representation of intersectionality? How can we tell those stories in a better way? And then finally, I wanted to touch just a little bit on esports, because it's really seen some interesting growths and engagement through Getty Images visual GPS surveys. Esports can offer a way to achieve the emotional benefits of sport with a bit lower barriers to entry. And obviously what we mean by there is not necessarily needing the physical prowess and that expectation by a consumer on themselves. So it's growing slowly, but overall the most inclusive sports that today's consumers really perceive is that football is the top at 50% of consumers agreeing to this, followed by swimming at 45%, athletics, track and field at 42%. And then obviously we've got the last two here that come in at 37%. And to understand where esports comes into that, it's growing, so it's at rank 7 right now. So this is just my very quick introduction and very quick look at the whole world of sport and how we can bring a better inclusive lens. But for today's talk, I'm very much going to dive a little bit deeper now into really bringing an inclusive lens on women's sport. And the top finding that we have found through our Getty Images visual GPS research, when we speak to men, when we speak to women, when we speak to all age groups across different countries, fundamentally women are telling us they feel they're on the sidelines. And they are telling us that the gender divide in sports, personally for them, starts at a young age. Now, I know across a lot of research for different sports organizations, they are talking very significantly about the drop-off in participation, especially around the time of pre-puberty and puberty. And if we think about women's sports, it is really a very challenging and rich history of leadership through adversity. There has always been a fight for visibility. There's always been a fight to participate. And it is essentially a rich history of relentless gender barriers that women have had to fight for, to break through. And while we've seen, great surge last year, this year increasingly, there's still a long way to go to really begin to understand with that history, how can we get better coverage, equal coverage to other, for example, male counterparts for female athletes. So I'm always quite interested to understand, and this is a really good image here from the archive, to understand, well, what do our customers here at Getty Images, if it's the media, if it's corporate, if it's brands in the run-up to key events, what are they choosing to remember from the rich archive here at Getty Images? What are the images that they're looking to license to use in their communications? So very interestingly, we've seen a huge surge last year around this key moment here of Kathy Switzer, which I'm sure a lot of you will recognize on the call, who was a female athlete who really wanted to partake in the Boston Marathon in 1969. And this moment here that has been captured is where on the left-hand side over her shoulder, you've got a key official from the Boston Marathon wrestling to take her off the path because he didn't agree that she should be allowed to participate. And on the right-hand side, you've got her husband, you've got her coach, you've got some other male, participants who are equally fighting with him to keep her on. And she did successfully go on to complete the marathon. But ultimately, when we look across at some of these key moments here, This is what our customers chose to remember in the run-up to the Olympics for Tokyo. And it is very much a celebration of firsts. It's very much storytelling around the female pioneers across their individual sports. It's about the first time that women fought to take part of the Olympics. It's about the first time that we had the first woman in the history of the modern Olympic Games to light the Olympic fire. It's very much about, the prowess of athleticism. But again, it will be interesting to see, can we evolve this further? Can we bring in even more voices, more stories to this? And that's also not just focused on female athletes, but that's focused on, coaching, support staff, that's focused on leadership in terms of ownership around sports rights organizations. Now, my next slide here is we're going to pause for a moment, and we're going to look at some very more recent research when we look at what media is gravitating towards when it comes to the most popular moments from key events that focus on female sports, and how the messaging has changed over time. So we're going to look at the time period of 2016 to 2021. If we look at the top row here, this obviously, as you'll recognize, is the Olympics of 2016. Simone Biles was very much up at the top in terms of what people were engaging with. But I think what's interesting here is that the storytelling and those moments that were being put in front of the media customers was very much about the skill and athleticism of the athletes in the moment of their performance, or there was some storytelling about compassion between competitors within the female space. Now, if we compare that to 2019, where we've seen the most engagement, the most downloads by our media customer, very much focused on the US women's team. And there was lots of controversy over how competitive can a female athlete be? What is society going to negotiate and accept? Is there a difference between how a female athlete can express competitiveness versus a male athlete? And, I'm sure some of you recognize that pivotal moment of Alex Morgan making the teacup gesture. But again, it was quite interesting to understand that, is there a limit? Is there a range of emotionals that female athletes are not expected, or in some ways not allowed, or feel imposed upon not to express within their performance? And then also we began to see a lot more coverage behind the scenes going into the locker rooms. And then finally, if we look at 2021, which, let's put it into a context, was a difficult year. We were coming off the back of the disruption in 2020 to the sports sector. But I think it's really interesting that after that disruption, when we look at 2021, there was a lot more here when it comes to the different emotions that female athletes are expressing. When we see stories of activism from Naomi Osaka, when we see Emma Hayes here expressing emotion at this key moment. And again, we begin to see some of the firsts as well, and especially more on the officiating staff side. This is Myra Shaka, first Black woman ever named to the NFL's officiating staff. So moving forward, where are we going? How are things evolving? How can we impact on people to really guide them in terms of what the end sports fan wants to see? So I'm going to take a break now, and I want to focus a little bit more on what we call body empowerment and seeing how sports fans and non-sports fans, the wider consumers, really gravitate towards seeing people with different body shapes, types, sizes, skill levels, and abilities at all ages, across all genders, very much at their top sports visual preferences. And yet, if we think back to the whole rich, history of sports science research, there was often a missing of female physiology. When I talk to a lot of older female athletes, they often joke and laugh maybe back in the 70s, the 80s, when they're on a football team, they often had to wear, the male uniforms. But there is kind of very seismic shifts under that and how it impacts the life care of a female athlete. So I put together just some very poignant, very strong visual stories that speak quite a bit to the difference in messaging over the years when it comes to the life care of a female athlete and how sometimes it's not where it should be. You'll recognize Burl Burton. She was one of the greatest cyclists the UK has ever known. She collapsed and died on her bike at the age of 59 due to limited research on the health of older women who were once professional athletes. We've got Alsana Montano, who you'll all recognize as the pregnant runner. You know, she has since come out in recent years, you know, very much communicating how she was too afraid to lose her sponsorship contract. So she actually competed while being pregnant. She not only did it once, she did it twice across both pregnancies, while she was 8 months and while she was 5 months pregnant. Now, at the time, there was some conversation about how empowering it was, how, you know, far we've come as females. The female athletes could compete at this very professional level while heavily pregnant. But again, it's interesting, and we've seen Alison Felix come out about this as well, how, you know, when brand sponsors run up their contracts, it's really not talking about the role of parenthood, the role of maternity cover, and the pressure that puts on a female athlete. Serena Williams, you know, great moment here in 2017, winning the Grand Slam at the Australian Open, but again, doing it while she was 2 months pregnant. But again, that story moves on, and we've seen in recent years at the French Open, you know, after, you know, giving birth to her daughter, she wore the infamous now catsuit, which was the one-piece black catsuit. And again, you know, it was banned by the French Open, but the conversation from Serena's point of view was very much about the absolute need post-birth to wear a full compression suit because of the danger of blood clots. And again, that would enable her performance, and it puts female physiology to the fore of that decision. Then finally, we've got Sophie Power here, who very much, and it's quite a very strong and powerful image. She's seen here breastfeeding her son Cormac at a rest stop during the 105-mile Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc race. And this image hit the media in 2018. And again, you know, you've got the male competitor on the side, and it's really showcasing again the priorities of parenthood and female physiology within this story. And then finally, we have Heather Watson here crashing out of the Australian Open in 2015. And she very publicly, and it was one of the first times that an athlete publicly spoke to this issue, but she put her poor performance down to starting her period. So as we moved on throughout the years, we have really begun to see, especially in the last 2 years, that more and more organizations across different types of sports disciplines are very much putting a female first approach when it comes to understanding female physiology and the impact on performance. So whether it's tracking menstrual cycles to personalized trainings and really unlocking the best moments that can really help a professional athlete to perform at their best. Yet, BBC brought out a key study in 2020 that says that many athletes still do not feel comfortable discussing this topic with their coaches. So to that end, I wanted to share here a couple of examples. It's looking further and it's looking outward across, you know, the advertising landscape, and how a lot of brands are really trying to change that story, being mindful of who they want to tell stories around and how they're telling that stories, and what practical products that they're putting in place that really is focusing on body empowerment, that is looking to stem the drop off around puberty or around the perimenopause or the menopause. And again, it's very interesting types of visuals that we haven't quite seen before, and it's really beginning to have an impact, especially on the younger generation. But the one example I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail is the Nike example here on the bottom left-hand corner. And Nike approached us here during the COVID pandemic, and they asked us to create a collection of visual content for them that will very much support the launch of their new inclusive sportswear. Now, it was running in Dubai, and this is where our team in London managed to handle all of the aspects of the shoot during these very challenging times. But what we found was that really telling that very important messaging of inclusive visual storytelling around Nike's inclusive sportswear had a very big impact on them. They were so happy with the visuals that you see here that were captured that they expanded the use of their visuals across all retail outlets in Dubai. Now I'm going to bring another intersectional lens when it comes to women's sport. And today we can't go through every layer of identity, but I do want to talk about age. And I want to put a little bit of a focus on some of the key messaging we're receiving through our consumer surveys, which is around the aging out of sports. While we know that people want to eliminate representation hurdles in sport, there's often a disconnect when it comes to representing age. And this equally applies across gender to female athletes, to older people who really want to continue their participation in sport, or to, older women who, they've raised their children, they haven't had the opportunity to get involved in sports. They want to take up something new, but they're not really seeing their visual representation out there. Now, for me, what was one of the most poignant data points out of our surveys is really beginning to understand how we're seeing an aging out of sport that is not just about physically getting involved in a sport, but it's also about watching sport and following sport on social media, for instance. So the graphs that you're looking at here, keep an eye on the gray bar on each one of these. And you really can see that as you decline in age, for our boomers in particular, you can begin to see a significant drop off over playing, watching, and following. So something really needs to be done. And I think this is where inclusive visual storytelling can play a very important role. So I want to share with you one very practical case study, again, that we completed during some of the most difficult lockdown conditions in the UK during COVID. We had been long working with women in sport for a good year, having conversations, sharing mutual research. And women in sport were really focused on research that they were doing around women in midlife between the ages of 40 to 55, where they were seeing a drop-off in engagement with sport. And they wanted to do something about it. So we worked together to create a gallery of content that is 100% powered by women, both in front of and behind the camera, that really showcases inspirational, real women up and down the UK, whether they're single parents, whether they're key voices within particular communities, whether they're running, very aspirationally and inspiringly, football clubs, for instance, like Cogs, Collies, I think Carol Bates might be on the session here today, or whether it's open water swimming groups that, are for friends. They wanted to really show and inspire by bringing that lens, by showing that intersectionality of females across different socioeconomic backgrounds, across different regionality, across different kind of pressures that they face, whether they're the sandwich generation looking after children or, also taking care of older parents. They wanted to do something to change this story. Now, what I can say to you, which is really shows the impact of this type of visual storytelling, all of this content was shot in the UK. You can tell by some of the skies there, if you look at it quite closely, that it is very much reflecting UK weather. That when we offered this to sports rights holders, when we offered it to all types of, media customers, advertisers, different types of brands, and even small to medium businesses, this collection has been so successful. It's been downloaded in over 44 plus countries around the world, and every shoot has been engaged with. And it just shows that when you bring a more considered, inclusive, and intersectional lens, people will really gravitate towards that visual storytelling. Why? Because it's emotive, it's inspiring, and it drives participation. And so to that end, this is just a couple more images from the football shoot in particular, and also a little bit of feedback from Wendy Hawke, who we worked with quite closely, the head of engagement and communications at Women in Sport, who just wanted to say that it really changed the needle for them in terms of the stereotypes and cliches you might think about around the menopause. And so we put in bold here, the fact that now when you search menopause, you won't find a ticking clock or sweaty and angry women is critical for helping to move the dial on representation of women at this life stage. So to that end, we have over the last 5 years here at Getty Images really been putting a focus across gender on people aged 50 plus, and really beginning to understand that, across the world, we are looking at aging populations, and we are beginning to see a much more rich diversity of what it means to be 50 plus, 60 plus, 70, 80, 90, and even up to 100. How do you tell rich storytelling? How do you capture stories that really focus on sports participation? Whether it's, at the grassroots levels, whether it's within the coaching staff, whether it's the volunteers, whether it's individuals looking after their individual health, are looking for community by joining a club. And ultimately, I think for all of us here on the call today, I don't think anyone underestimates the potential for women's sports. The conversation is really happening right now, and yet there's lots to be done. And the commercial opportunities are there. Sponsorship for women's sports is expected to eclipse 1 billion globally, according to a study from Deloitte. So how do fans feel about this? How do consumers feel about this? Well, we found through Getty Images visual GPS that the support for this is increasing year on year when we carry out these surveys. We find that for people of all genders across all countries, they really support equality. 72% of consumers feel sports organizations could do more to promote women's teams and female stars. 78% say it's very important to give female athletes the same coverage as their male counterparts. We also find, and I don't have that stat there, but we also find that 75% say it's very important to give people with disabilities the same coverage as well. Now, they also have an opinion on how they want to see female athletes represented and the types of sports visuals that are really genuinely going to connect with them and inspire them. So 76%, which is a huge majority, want to see female athletes portrayed in an authentic way that focuses on their skill, their athleticism, rather than their beauty, their glamour, or their sex appeal. And finally, just genuine gender equality in sport, close to 8 in 10 are agreeing that athletes should be paid based on their performance and overall contribution to the sport or sports rights organization, regardless of their gender. So to that end, what do we want to do here at Getty Images? We very much want to help to provoke discussion, to, really begin to consider what are the questions that we should think about? What are the points that we should consider when it comes to bringing a much more inclusive lens? So to that end, we put together our Women and Girls in Sport guidelines. Now, we started this work back in 2018, and obviously it has evolved over time because always the conversation around visuals is negotiated. Think about the fact that all of us have a camera on our smartphones, we're capturing, some of us are a bit more sophisticated with editing apps. There's huge conversations about retouching, for instance, but ultimately everybody is sharing those visual stories online on social media. So what it means is that people are becoming very much more visual literate. So you want to begin to have a conversation about, well, what are the stories that are not being told around women and girls in sport? And then what are the visual stereotypes that are being leaned on, maybe too much, and need to be expanded upon? So ultimately, we want to bring an inclusive lens. Why? People's perception of what is possible in sport is often shaped by who they are and what they want to see. So ultimately, we wanted to look at many different layers of identity because we know that there's not one look to a woman or a girl participating in sport. And often there can be visual stereotypes around a particular sport, what's seen as most attractive, what would draw the most brand sponsorship, for instance, or individually the pressures that a female athlete can feel on how they express themselves. Now, I'm not going to go through every question here today, but I'm going to give you a flavor of these guidelines, and we will share after today's session. So I'd really encourage you, do check them out. There's some very powerful imagery included within these guidelines. But ultimately, across gender, for instance, are you providing an equitable range of options of different moments for women and girls participating at all levels in sport? Are you showing female support staff and non-binary staff, whether it's coaches, trainers, medical staff, organizational staff, or umpires? Are you showing women and girls sports fans? So let's bring it down to who's really supporting. So again, it's that playing, watching, following. Are you showing them from all backgrounds and maybe supporting something stereotypically that's considered to be a male sport like combat or motor sports? When it comes to age, and we've spoken a little bit about this, but again, are you really beginning to understand not just about the aging out of sport, but where we're seeing the drop-offs in sport? Are you showing relatable visuals, whether it's around puberty? Are you really beginning to understand, with the way that preteens nowadays, with the amount of visual content, they're driving themselves, they're capturing themselves, what is it within those visual stories that is most going to capture their attention and drive participation within a particular sport? Are you showing only certain sports, for example, for women who are aged 45 plus? Are you equating older age maybe with declining physical prowess, and you haven't considered that within the sport stories that you're either capturing, creating, or selecting to put into communications? When it comes to ability, very strong indication here from our visual GPS research that fans say it's important to give athletes with disabilities the same coverage as their able-bodied counterparts. So again, really comes down to, are you showing female athletes with disabilities in isolation? Are you showing the whole experience of them within their sport? What range of sports, again, are you really showing around a person who with disabilities participating? Is it on the elite side? Is it on the grassroots level? And all of these obviously crossover, but again, are you thinking about culture? Are you representing women and girls from diverse cultures around the world? If you are doing that, well, how are you moving that representation beyond tokenization? Again, just really try to check your own unconscious bias. Take a pause, have a look, ask yourself, what am I using? What's my go-to? What am I gravitating towards all the time? How can I change that up? How can I take responsibility to bring much more inclusion to my viewpoint in the types of visuals that I'm selecting or creating? And again, the same for sexuality. And then finally, two last stories that we've touched upon already, but I just want to bring it full circle. When it comes to body empowerment, it is crucially important. When we carry out surveys here at Getty Images, we really look to understand what is driving the need for inclusive visual storytelling. And quite sadly, people are telling us it's their personal experience of discrimination on a daily basis that drives their need to really see their experiences normalized across the visuals that they see. So again, it depends across gender. We find that the top 3 biases that are most experienced by any group across all of the 25 countries we've looked at, out of 10 different biases we've looked at, is always gender, body, and ability. And with body, it's encountered differently for males versus females. We find that women on average tend to tell us that they encounter most body discrimination because they're seen to be too curvy, too heavy, or to have skin imperfections. Whereas for men, we see that they're most often likely to encourage discrimination because they say that they're seen to be too skinny, too weak, or too tall. So again, it's very important to understand, am I showing, different body types, sizes, and abilities? Am I avoiding showing grime, dirt, sweat, and blood? A couple of years ago, there was lots of conversations about, how ladylike do you have to show representation? But I think we've evolved from that conversation over the last few years. But again, it comes down to, are you representing parenthood in female sport to really encourage people during those moments in their lives that they still continue to participate in sport, or that there's equity for female athletes? And then retouching is always an interesting one. And I think it's very important to understand, for those of you who are really driving key visual communications, are you retouching? Have you considered how comfortable, for example, a female athlete might feel with having their images retouched? Think about skin retouching, different ethnic skins. We've often had conversations with female athletes where they don't like the fact that their skin has been lightened, maybe inadvertently because they're balancing it out across a different range group of people who have different ethnicities and skin colors. But again, it's really understanding, am I showing body empowerment? What are the decisions I'm making to actually capture a story or to select a story? And then ultimately, the final story I want to touch upon is really around mental health and emotions, because they kind of go inextricably linked together. There is really great leadership right now by key female athletes around the world who I feel are very much leading conversations around mental health, not just within sport, but across society. And I think more and more of those discussions really need to happen, especially given the fact that we've gone through this very unique human experience of the COVID pandemic. So again, it's really asking yourself, well, am I addressing mental health in my visual communications? Am I challenging social stigmas in women's sport? Am I showing female athletes, women and girls, actually receiving sport within the moment of the competition at the grassroots level? Am I turning that vulnerability into a strength? And that very, generous, power to share vulnerability is really key. And then finally, with emotions, we've talked about it a lot, but I just want to summarize it just a little bit. There is genuine, often gender stereotypes that female athletes are telling us they feel is associated with certain sports, and it really limits their self-expression within that sport, because often they might be afraid that they might lose some brand sponsorship, or they're trying to attract a specific type of brand sponsorship. So again, it's often asking yourself, how often do I personally associate certain emotions with certain sports? Am I only portraying, for example, female boxers as angry and gymnasts as happy and charming? Have I allowed female athletes, women and girls, including support staff, umpires and so on, have I allowed them the full range of emotions that can be experienced when playing sport? Often I've had conversations with female athletes where they might go in to do headshots, or, they're promoting some gear for the sports rights organization, and they'll feel with the briefs and what they're being asked to do, there's more of a focus on them being smiley, being cheerful, being happy, or being successful and really sharing that kind of moment. And they don't feel that their male counterparts, for example, might be asked to do the same thing. So again, it's really trying to understand, are you creating an environment where you're either creating or selecting content that allows female athletes to bring their full emotional expression and their authentic selves? So as I've said throughout this, we're really very much focusing on how we can build deeper understanding. How can we bring in much more multitude of perspectives for female athletes, both at the elite and grassroots levels? The Women's Sports Trust has been, incredibly generous with us here at Getty Images. They invited us to come in and speak to their female athletes on their Unlocked program. And this was really representing a wide variety of sports disciplines. And it was very interesting to have conversations. We had female athletes saying, they'd never been asked this before when it comes to their own visual representation. They were very keen to have that arena to be able to express their opinions. And some of the key takeaways from a lot of those conversations that we've had have really come down to the fact that for female athletes themselves, they're saying that action shots are really important. They're creating their own stories, they're putting it on social media, they're watching, what their audiences and often the younger fans are engaging with. And they have told us, and we've done some little bit of research here in Getty Images ourselves, that it does come down to those, performance moments, the action shots that are very inspiring, or where you're taking somebody behind the scenes to show them your performance training schedules. They're also saying that it's important to set the scene at shoots, with female athletes. They need a better understanding of what's been asked for, why it's been asked for, why they're asking, to maybe strike a certain pose. And they want to understand how can they bring their personalities more on the shoot. And again, ultimately, as we just spoke about, it is being aware of our all individual unconscious bias. When we carry out lots of surveys and research here at Getty Images through visual GPS on unconscious bias, we find that most people will say they're not biased, but everyone else is. And they don't mean it like that, but they'll find I'm not individually biased, but I am encountering bias. But ultimately, we really need to begin to start, because nobody around the world is unbiased. So again, it's trying to understand what are the expectations that are being set. So again, we had feedback from a smiley female cricket bowler who said that she felt great pressure to be smiley all the time, whereas our male counterpart, she perceived, was allowed to have maybe a bit more of an aggressive, expression within what he's been asked within the shoot. So again, just really beginning to understand that fundamentally trust is very important. So the last point I wanted to address here before we kind of summarize and finish up for a very fruitful, I hope, discussion is that, over the years here, we've seen conversation about, well, who's behind the lens? Would it be better for female athletes? Are they more comfortable if there's female perspectives behind the lens shooting those stories? And that was very definitely a very genuine conversation. It's something that we've really looked at here at Getty Images. We've run some internship programs, that have been very successful, and we have now full-time female editorial sports photographers here. But what we found from those conversations we're having is it's beginning to change. And actually what people are more talking about is that they feel comfortable with who is behind the camera. And it's really about their intersectionality, their variances of perspectives that they're bringing across lots of identity factors that all intersect. So finally, I'm going to finish up today by talking about two last kind of case studies that we have here at Getty Images, and really trying to keep continuing to increase the visibility gap in women's sports, but also really trying to provoke discussion and really keep the conversation going and really understand how do we bring that multitude of perspectives together to take next steps. So in April of this year, we were invited in partnership with MC Saatchi to run a women's sports exhibition at the Saatchi Gallery for 3 weeks in London. It was very much focused on the visual depiction of women's sports, specifically over the last 50 years. Now, it was quite an audacious task, I will tell you, to really set up a process that facilitated co-collaborating on that curation to begin to understand how visual stories evolved and the very momentous moments in visual storytelling that really seismically changed and impacted the visibility on women's sport. So to that end, we here at Getty Images, including myself, but also some key voices across the media, like Anna Kessel, who was with the Telegraph at the time, to some of our Paralympians, to some of our rugby stars here in the UK, work together to bring that different level of perspectives to curate an exhibition that really opened questions on body empowerment, on emotions, on mental health, on activism within female sport. And then finally, just recently, in the first 2 weeks of November, so just very recently, we've worked with the Lawn Tennis Association. Now, with tennis, it's often seen to be leading when it comes to gender equality in sport. But again, this was very much where the LTA invited us to curate an exhibition that would really focus on how do we drive greater, youth participation at a local level? How do we engage all audiences across lots of different identity factors? And really look back at women's tennis and focus on those moments and a very rich, immersive visual journey that speaks to understanding, not just for female athletes, but also for female support staff, for the volunteers, for people who have participated over time within the sport at the grassroots level. How can we engage people within those stories? So again, very successful exhibition, and really was about bringing together an inclusive lens, but ultimately to provoke discussion. So I'm on my final slide, you'd be glad to know, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that discussion. And it's just really, we're really trying to understand how can we continue to push for change? How can we begin to open up the discussion on things we might not have considered in terms of what needs to come in front of that lens to tell a much more inclusive story? How can we get more conscious of the stereotypes across specific sports, across women's sports in general? Who's not being represented? And most importantly, if they are, how are they being represented? So ultimately, it comes down to the fact that while we won't reverse limiting stereotypes overnight, together, by getting that conversation going, we can create impact with inclusivity and empathy. So thank you for your time. I'm going to hand back over to you, Sue. We've got a good 10 minutes to get that conversation going, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions in the Q&A channel.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I think it's the second time I've seen half of that, and it's fascinating again. Every time I see it, I learn more too. So no, it really is really very thought-provoking, I think, in terms of the content you share. Just a quick question. I've got many questions coming through, but one of the first questions was around that came halfway through. In terms of, you talked about the most inclusive sports that we're seeing. How is that measured? Is that in terms of the visual depiction? How are you measuring inclusivity in that sense? On that slide?
Yeah, so that's a good qualifying question on the data. So essentially, this is where we're asking consumers. So I always say with a consumer, they can be a sports fan, they can be a non-fan, right? But this is where we're going at asking at 7,000 plus consumers of 25 countries what they perceive to be an inclusive sport. Now, what we have to do in the next round of research that we're going to do is understand why. So they're just ultimately, they're not looking at any visuals. They're just telling us what they feel out of their experience or their perception, let's say from the media, what happens to be an inclusive sport. So we have a lot more work to do now to understand, well, why and why not, which I think is probably even more important, and where we can do better on that. So not directly tied with visuals. Thank you.
I think you preempted one of my questions, which was actually, are women more comfortable when there are women behind the lens, or do we see different pictures when it's women behind the lens? And I liked, I guess, that comment, if it's how inclusive the photographer or videographer is in terms of making people feel inclusive there. I just wondered, my own personal question before I go to others, is there anything geographically that you see that's different in terms of the pictures that are being downloaded, whether it is from North America or from Australia, New Zealand versus Western Europe? Do you see a difference in, when you talk each year about different photos that are most appealing, is there a difference geographically?
Not significantly, and I'm interestingly always asked this question, Sue, and I think we always hope there'll be key differences because it leads to key insights. But we're finding consistently, the more times that we do this research, there's very little, and I sometimes think it comes down to the fact because of photography, right? Because we've kind of globalized our way around, you know, creating content ourselves individually and then what we're sharing. There is a lot more consistency now across regions. We do see that certain sports spike higher. Absolutely. For Southeast Asia, there's certain sports like esports that I showed for a male demographic of a particular size. But I know that sports rights holders individually will have their own much more in-depth research than we have here. But we do find, yes, certain sports definitely increase. But overall, the types of visual stories, number one, that has been downloaded is not inclusive enough. There's a huge amount that needs to be done. So it means there's great opportunity here to do more, to differentiate, to get more conscious, to do that. And I think number two on that point, it's very much down to, are we creating those stories in the first place for them to be available for, you know, for the media to download and use, or for advertisers to use within their communications. So again, that's why we have this ongoing conversation on, well, who owns the visualization of women? I mean, I think it's all of us. And how do we keep negotiating and talking about that conversation and making sure that we're really considering all those points? And sometimes it takes time. We have to slow down to pause to consider those points.
Thank you. And a question from Terry here, which I think a similar question almost, of where we're going to in the future. So where is, what do you see? I was going to ask you what you've talked about, the trends in 2019, 21, 22. What have you seen this year? Whether you've already got an inkling of what the downloads or the trends have been for 2022. But where do you see, based on what you've done in the last 6 years, where do you see the trends are moving forwards?
Well, I think obviously we're seeing it already now, and I think we were impatient back in 2018, and we hoped we'd be where we are now back in 2018 when we launched the Women and Girls in Sport guidelines. But sometimes it's taken some of these seismic moments, you know, of a key event or rolling moments together that begins to roll things on a more kind of visibility level across media that can trigger these conversations. But obviously we want to see much more intersectionality happening, and that's where things are rolling towards. But I think in general, women's sport, when you talk about inclusion, you can't not think about sustainability, for example. You know, how do we put that to the fore? I think that's going to rise even more importance around women's sport as well. And I think also around technology in terms of fan participation. You know, we've got the rise of Web 3.0 technologies. You know, I know lots of people right now not quite sure what to do with it. But interestingly, we're carrying out a lot of our research to understand how are consumers feeling about it. Are they interested in emerging technologies? Are they interested in it in the world of sport? And it depends. There is interest. It's growing. It's not so easy to say it's just the younger generation and not the older generation. Again, Sue, to your point, that could change geographically. But it's understanding, you know, are people excited? They might not know how to use it, but what's the value they actually want to get out of it? And the value ultimately comes down all the time that it's really about that kind of holistic health benefits, and they want to understand how they can belong.
Thank you. A question there, is the exhibition moving anywhere else? And it was a fabulous exhibition, but again, it wasn't there for that long, and they're amazing content. So are there any plans to do any more with that?
Not that I know of right now, but that's something obviously we'll be in conversation with the Lawn Tennis Association and also the International Tennis Federation as well. So yes, it's great to get that feedback. Great that it was very engaging. For me, it was very inspiring just to have that camera there and to see the, you know, people who are engaging with the exhibition. It really did show that it does pull in some of those kind of drop-off points, some of those, you know, demographics that the LTA was trying to reach. So again, I think the power of visuals is enormous. It has huge impact. So so let's come back, let's circle back on that. But also I think it's a good opportunity here for anybody who has interesting stories, interesting ideas. They'd love to find out a way, how can I get it covered? How can I create that storytelling? You know, please do come and have a conversation with us here at Getty Images about that.
I was fascinated, and Kate's reflected there in terms of the more the real emotions, seeing more the real emotions of female athletes. So is that down to brands and sponsors to be requesting more of that in their advertising too, as much as it is the sports rights holders sharing that content? Where's the kind of push-pull in beginning to change what we see depicted for female athletes?
So I think I think there's been this hero, this hero type of storytelling that's gone on for a very long time. And I mean, it's a really strong one that people gravitate towards, the underdog and so on. But I think for female athletes, they have told us very honestly, they might have just won a big race, for instance, and they feel this unbelievable pressure when all the cameras come around that I'm not saying they can't be too sweaty, but they have it in their mind that they have to look a certain way for the brand sponsor, or to support, to get better brand sponsors, let's put it that way. So they're feeling that pressure themselves that they don't feel is happening maybe equally for their male counterparts. And I was interested, I was just on a conversation before this with somebody else, but it was interesting where ZDF in Europe, they have, it's probably worth just having a quick Google on YouTube, but they did a conversation where journalists asked male athletes the same questions that would be asked of female athletes. And it's very interesting to see the responses to those. So again, that kind of shows in those moments the impliedness. And that's why we have to take a pause to understand here female athletes, what they want to bring themselves authentically. Because obviously they have a goal where they want to engage, more of the fans, they want to engage more of the brand sponsors. But it is understanding how can we open that out and how can we truly find where the points are. So for that reason, we here at Getty Images are very focused on understanding the Gen Alpha that are coming up, Gen Z, the millennials, and then not forgetting the boomers and Gen X's, but understanding the non-sports fan, the potential fan, let's put it that way, or interesting how you categorize yourself as a fan as well.
And it's fascinating that you said 76% of people want to see female athletes depicted as athletes. So that's almost a mismatch of what sponsors and others or brands even are wanting, how to depict women, when actually that isn't what the audience want to see. So where do we kind of connect that? Is that about sharing that data so we begin to understand what it is that consumers actually want to see?
And Sue, as I said before, that's not a one-off, right? That's something we ask quite a bit, and it's growing. It's growing. It's gone up, I think, another 6 points in the last couple of months. So it's growing. And when we kind of take, if we ask the questions around not female athletes, but we ask the question just around people involved in sport, it's interesting as well, because what comes up number one is people of all genders. Number two is different body shapes, types, and sizes. Number three is people with disabilities. Number four, I think, is different skill levels, And then number five is just seeing real people, just real people from all different backgrounds. So that inclusive lens is very important. But we tried to break it down a little bit more, and I didn't include it here today, but we tried to find out from the consumer expectation of visuals of an athlete, they're interested in the physical and mental, story around the athlete and how that's visualized. And it's those two, I would say, that most strongly resonate today.
Brilliant. I've got more questions coming in, but I'm going to stop because it's 1 o'clock, and we're so grateful to you for your time. We will share a recording of the webinar. We won't be sharing the slides themselves, but we'll share a recording of the webinar in the next week or so. But thank you so much to Jacqueline for giving her time today. I know it's quite lots to think about and go away and put into action, and I'm sure others will follow up with you too from here. But really appreciate your time, and thank you to everybody that joined us, and hopefully we'll see you at another webinar or networking call again soon. So thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.